Hello, everybody. This is the lecture talking about the non-consumptive effects of predation. So everything we've been talking about with predation before, or so far, has been concentrating on, what happens when predation is actually successful. But there's a lot of really cool interactions that we see, or results that we see due to when predation either isn't successful or is happening in the community, but then survivors really change their behavior, their life history, and their morphology based on this ecology of fear. Okay, so we know that this fear of predation has a big impact on prey, right? Prey are really, really skittish, right? Like white-tailed deer are always on the lookout for predators, even though in most of their range, they don't really have any successful predators other than humans and hunting, which is, potentially a big impact here. But it shapes the life of prey species potentially very strongly. So I kind of want to start thinking about this question: do prey avoid predation at all costs? Now, prey certainly want to avoid predation, but how much? Another way to maybe ask this question is the safest place the best place? And the answer is, well, yes and no, right? If, from the individual level, it's pretty clear that animals should be as safe as they can, right? The prey species should try to act as safely as they can so that they can live and have a successful life, right? And especially, if this turtle has enough food, it probably should just stay in its shell, closed up like that for as long as possible. But we know that, eventually things have to go out and get food. Things have to go find mates. So you cannot just completely hunker down forever. And then secondly, on a kind of like a different level, or a different aspect of what I want to say, not just at the individual level, but when we're thinking about populations, remember that evolution works at the population level. Natural selection works at that population level. And remember that behavior is shaped by evolution. So natural selection then is going to be balancing that individual survival versus the population growth rates. So from a population perspective, is the safest place the best place? The answer is no, right? So this bird here, while it did lay its eggs, it needs to go out and get food, because without getting that food, the population is never going to grow. Those babies will not have enough food. These fish here, these tiny little reef fish, are swimming really close to this really big predator, this moray eel. And they will swim close because they don't essentially want to waste energy. If they can be here, it might not be, some of these little tiny fish are going to get eaten, yes. And it might not be the safest place. But the whole population is going to be, there's going to be some selection for not having to always swim away from predators. Another example is wildebeests, right? Wildebeests oftentimes do these migrations across Africa, and they have to go across these rivers. Well, giant crocodiles, huge crocodiles, are in that water, in those rivers, and it's good for the population that the herd needs to move and migrate across, realizing though that a bunch of those individuals will die. So what we see is that maximizing the growth rates for either the population or the individual, not essentially natural selection um, will select for behavior, adaptations, all sorts of things that maximize the growth rate of the population. And that might mean that many individuals get eaten, but as long as the population growth rate is maximized, that's where natural selection will keep that behavior in the population, unless conditions change, and then there's a bunch of time for that to then re-equilibrate, but that takes a long time. So one example of this is diel vertical migration. So this happens in lakes all over the world, but let's think of a 3 trophic level system. Now there's other players in a lake, yes, but we only need to really think about the three trophic levels, where we've got algae, copepods, or it doesn't necessarily need to be just copepods. It can be Daphnia. It can be really any of those bigger branchiopod crustaceans, or the zooplankton. Pretty much any of the zooplankton, really. And then we have some sort of zooplanktivorous fish, so a fish that eats zooplankton. And pretty much every lake has these things, right? What doesn't really matter what species we're talking about. A lot of small minnows or silversides or small. Pretty much every lake has some sort of zooplanktivorous fish, where they're using, I should also say this is key, where they use vision to find these zooplankton. They're visual predators, right? Now, in most lakes we have an epilimnion and a hypolimnion. Now the lake might be too shallow for a hypolimnion, but let's talk about a kind of a classic Wisconsin lake, where we have the epilimnion, where the water's warm, there's plentiful food, that food being these algae. Okay, but then it gets cold as you go down deep, there's not very much food, and it's pretty dark. So what we see during the day, there's this huge difference in predation risk. Right? These are visual predators, so these zooplanktivorous fish really need to be able to see their prey, those copepods, to be able to eat them. So there's this huge gradient in that predation risk, where if they're deep enough, if it's dark enough, there's pretty much no risk of predation. But at nighttime, it's different. Right, that predation risk is pretty much common, maybe a little higher with like moonlight and stuff, but really, so these fish will stay up towards the top, but during the nighttime, then those copepods and those Daphnia will come up to the top and start feeding on all of that algae, because their growth rates are so much stronger, or so much higher, where all that food is, and they can really gain a bunch of energy by being up there to the top during the daytime and get all of that food without risking all that much predation, and then go back down during the day. So every day they'll be going down to the hypolimnion. Every night they'll be coming up into the epilimnion to feed, and we see this strategy that lots of different organisms will use across different taxa, so copepods, crustaceans, and we actually even see some of the algae themselves will kind of do a reversed vertical migration to kind of play against or do the opposite of what the zooplankton are doing to try to hide from them. So it's interesting interplay between these different groups at times. Now, a different effect that we see from predation is that this thing called ontogenetic niche shifts. And what that means is the word ontogenetic really means kind of development. As an organism develops, we see that they'll change their niche. And with oceanic fish, this is really, really common, where the young are much, much more vulnerable to predation. Young little baby fish, small fish, can't swim very fast. They can't get away from predators as easily. So where they do go is they only inhabit where the predators are not, lower predation areas. So mangroves are a great example, where all these little roots are underneath the water, and these big predators just can't swim through these tiny little roots. But the little baby fish have no problem swimming through there, and they'll stay in there. But then as they get larger, they'll come out, right? And so this is a non-consumptive effect of predation, because these are survivors. These are not organisms that are getting eaten, but they'll be changing where they are based on this different levels of predation in different areas. What I should say is also that there's maybe another aspect to this, that when young and adults live in different habitats, they reduce competition among themselves, among the two groups, among the ages, among the sizes. So there might be more to this story than just predation causing, or fear of predation causing, this ontogenetic niche shift. That's a hard phrase to say. Anyway, there's also some life history differences that we see that predation, or the threat of predation, can cause. And life history is kind of like not a very well-defined term, but it's how an organism balances, or the strategy it uses to allocate its resource, have different adaptations, do its behavior. It's just kind of like how the organism does stuff throughout its whole life. Okay? And what we can see is that different populations that are exposed to different threats of predation can actually change their life history. So a great example has to do with mayflies. Now, mayflies, also known as Ephemeroptera, is their scientific name. Here they are as their nymph, and here they are as their adult. Now, the adult has no mouth parts, right? The adults only live for a day or two. They basically mate and then die. Mate, lay their eggs, and die. So their fecundity, and remember, the fecundity means the number of eggs that they will lay, basically how many babies they'll have, is determined by their size. The bigger the female, the more eggs she'll be able to produce, and then, basically her size then is determined by how big she got as a baby, as that nymph stage. All their energy is gained as a nymph. Basically, a nymph is just a food energy acquisition machine. It's just a there's no gonads in the nymph. There's no wings. There's just basically a bunch of intestines and mouth parts, and the rest of it is just growing, storing up energy. Now, mayflies have this interesting interaction with brook trout. Brook trout are a invertebrate fish. They'll eat invertebrates in the streams. And so what you find is that in different streams with different numbers of brook trout, the mayfly communities look very, very different. So Bobby Pekarsky, an aquatic ecologist, looked at these mayflies. I forget where her original study was, but what she noticed was that where you find robust brook trout communities, or where there's a lot of brook trout in the community, the mayflies are really tiny. They come out real small, compared to these huge mayflies and these huge mayfly adults and nymphs in the streams that don't have brook trout. So she asked this really clever question of, is it actually a life history change where the nymphs metamorphose earlier, or is it a size selective predation kind of thing? So maybe it's in this stream here that the big ones are just eaten, right? If a brook trout has a choice between a big nymph and a small nymph, it's going to eat the big nymph, right? Because there's just more calories there, more energy there. Bigger bite of food, bigger payoff. So maybe the brook trout are just eating. I should also say the big ones are probably easier to see too. Maybe the brook trout are just eating the big ones. So she needed to do an experiment to figure this out. So what she did was took a population she took a population of these big nymphs, like the mayflies from the brook trout less stream. So there's no brook trout in this stream. She took these mayflies, and then all she did was add the water, right? She didn't actually add the predators themselves, but she just added the water. And what she found was, compared to the control, so these are just the original population, and the ones that were exposed to just the water were 13 to 20% smaller, and they laid 24 to 35% less or fewer eggs. They were less fecund than the non-predator, the no brook trout water population. And so what's happening is basically the chemical cues that those fish are putting into the water, these mayflies are picking up on. And they're kind of having to balance their life stages that said, hey, there's these predators in the water. There's no point for us to risk it so much or risk it so long, right? The longer a mayfly stays in the water, the higher probability that it's going to get eaten. So what they do is they metamorphose earlier, and what happens then is these are non-lethal effects, right? Like, these individuals are not getting eaten, but the non-lethal effects actually exceeded the direct effects of consumption in these streams. So what does this mean? Basically, with this scenario here, where just adding the water, the cues, what you get is 24 to 30%, 35% less eggs coming out of this community. But if you look at how many individuals are eaten, it's much less than 24 to 35%, right? There's only a very small fraction of these mayflies are actually eaten, but because they have this life history change, it makes this bigger change just due to these non-lethal effects. So balancing and trying to figure out how to avoid predation is really, really important for all sorts of organisms, pretty much any organism we want to talk about, right? So there's a whole lot of inducible defenses, what we call, of these defenses that are able to be produced whether they are produced when there are predators around, and they're not produced when predators are not around, right? And these are, these are visible with pretty much the whole community, but really strongly in those survivors and, the non-consumed individuals. So an example, probably the most classic example, are Daphnia head spikes and tail spines. These two are the same species of Daphnia. This is scanning electron microscope picture of them. But what we see is this is a species of Daphnia that's been exposed to predator cues, and this is one that hasn't. Basically, this tail spine and the tail spine and the helmet spike are make the Daphnia harder to get eaten because it's like got these spikes and its gape limits certain tiny. If a tiny little fish can't open its mouth, this wide, it's not going to be able to eat this Daphnia. So it makes it so it's harder for them fish to eat it. Another example is trichomes on leaves. So if you look at a plant that has been eaten by a lot of big herbivores they'll oftentimes grow these little hairs on the leaf called trichomes, and it kind of makes the leaf taste yucky, and it's hard for herbivores to eat it. So they leave those leaves alone and look for leaves that don't have trichomes. Another example here are these tadpoles. These are all the same species of tadpole. These are all the same age of tadpole also. But these are not exposed to predators. These are exposed to some predators, and these are exposed to the most predators. And what you see is a difference in tail shape. Now, it's pretty subtle here, but what you have is a longer, skinnier tail. And here you have a fatter tail. And is essentially what it is these tadpoles have a bigger oar. These tadpoles have a bigger paddle so that when they flick their tail, they can accelerate faster and get out of the way of the predator. But the thing is, these tadpoles then are, they can't, it takes more energy to swim, right? They're not as streamlined as these slender little guys up here. The Daphnia over here that have the long tails spine and head spike, it's harder for them to swim too. And just think about all the little energy, in the individual trichome is not that much energy, but when you're covering your leaves in these extra little things, that takes a lot of energy. So we see these inducible defenses cost something. They oftentimes make them inferior competitors, right? So if you were to look at like feeding rate between these two Daphnia, this one is going to be able to feed faster because it's going to be able to swim more efficiently, faster, and just get more food. That translates to lower growth rates, and it also might mean more energy use. So these tadpoles with the thicker tails, while they might be able to swim faster, it uses a lot more energy. So, there's some bad things about antipredative defenses, but there's some, definitely good things. And, those good things are not getting eaten. But from maybe a little different perspective, the benefit of having a defense that you can turn on and off, whether at the population level or, from just like a behavior or something like that, it saves resources, right? The individuals don't need to waste energy, growing, in this case for snails, a really thick shell when there's no predators. And they see here is this is for this Physis snail here when there's predators in the water, or at least the chemical cues from the predators, those shells get about twice as thick pretty much. So that's good for those species here that this can be turned on and off, and they don't always, not all snails need to have that super thick shell. What we see is that a behavioral inducible defense can be activated instantaneously and turned off instantaneously. Morphological, oftentimes are large-scale body changes that might not be reversible, or if they are, they're reversible on a much longer time frame. And then can be some epigenetic effects where, especially in Daphnia, right? Like if you start with a population like this, a non-predator population, expose them to predators, and then they'll grow this long tail spine and head spike. But like the daughters of these ones will have those tail spines and head spikes, even though they're not necessarily exposed to predators. And those tail spines, long tail spines and long head spikes can last several generations with an epigenetic effect without actually being exposed to those predators. So it's kind of weird how that can last several generations. And they might be stuck in this like inducible defense being turned on when they don't really necessarily need it. The thing is that these inducible defenses, for them to be called an inducible defense, they need to be produced in response to a predator cue. Okay, and it's not necessarily the predator itself, but it might be some cue in the environment that lets the prey know that there is a predator around. So we see that this is relatively common when the predation pressure is really unpredictable. Okay, if it's like rare event, or it's really highly patchy where predation occurs and where it doesn't, if it's varied spatially or varied temporally, we expect inducible defenses to be more common. This is an example of those Crucian carp that were explained in your book, where this is the predator-free body morph, and these are the much deeper bodied fish. These are the same species. These might actually just, this fish will turn into this fish in just a couple months when it's exposed to these pike predators. But where there is unpredictability in predation, whether that's spatially or temporally or however we want to define it, these inducible defenses are expected to be more common. All right, with that, I'll see you later.